Cool. All right. Well, we're about 2 minutes in here, so I'm gonna get going. So I would like to thank our co-hosts of this webinar series, the Society of American Foresters. The Society of American Foresters is the national scientific and educational organization representing forestry and related natural resource professionals across the United States. Founded in 1900, SAF promotes science-based sustainable management and stewardship of the nation's public and private forests. If you'd like to learn more about the work that SAF does, you can see the link in the chat now. So our next webinar is November 5th from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern, and will feature Alton Perry and Bethany Wilkinson, both of the Sustainable Forestry and Land Retention Project. They'll present sustaining forests and securing family legacies with the SFLR network. You can scan the QR code on your screen now or click the link in the chat to webinar to register. So today we have Sara Kuebbing, who is the Director of Research of the Yale Applied Science Synthesis Program, as well as a research scientist at the Yale Center for Natural Carbon Capture in the Yale School of the Environment. Sara will be presenting Managing Forests in a Changing World. I got a few housekeeping notes here before we get moving. So first of all, we'll have about 15 minutes at the end of this presentation for Q&A. You can use the Q&A function or the chat to submit questions. We'll try to get to all of them. Additionally, if you'd like to sign up for our mailing list, you can scan the QR code on your screen now or click the link in the chat. If you'd like to be up to date with all of the ongoings of the FCCP and get reminders about upcoming webinars, I highly recommend you do that. And then finally, we have continuing forestry education credits available today, so it's SAF CFEs. If you registered using the same email as your SAF account, your credits will be automatically applied to your account. And if you registered with a different email, you can contact SAF directly, and their email is cf@safnet.org. So without further ado, here is Sara Kuebbing.
All right, thank you so much, Evan. Let me get my screen share up. All right, hopefully that looks good for everyone. Is that good, Evan?
Yep, looks great.
Perfect. All right, well, thanks so much for that introduction, and I'm very happy to be here today to share a little bit about this group that I run at Yale called the Yale Applied Science Synthesis Program, and then also some of the research coming out of our group. And so just to give a little bit of background, the Yale Applied Science Synthesis Program is a research program that's housed within the Forest School at the Yale School of the Environment. And as Evan also said, we also collaborate with another center at Yale, the Yale Center for Natural Carbon Capture, which is an initiative that's promoting scientific research for natural solutions to mitigate climate change. And we lead a lot of the research on how we manage forest lands and agricultural lands for climate mitigation and carbon storage for the Yale Center for Natural Carbon Capture. And I totally recognize that our name is a huge mouthful, and even many of our most ardent supporters at Yale sometimes have trouble remembering all the words in the acronym. To shorten our name, we call ourselves YASP for Yale Applied Science Synthesis Program, and I know that's only slightly better than the name itself. And so what I'd like to do is just set the stage by taking the first couple minutes to explain why we picked these specific words for our name and introduce some of the research that we do. So the first question that you might have is, what does YAS do? And you can read a lot about what we do here on our website at synthesis.yale.edu, but just to distill it down to 5 words, our goal is to help people make decisions. And more specifically, we really want to help people make decisions about how they manage their ecosystems, whether they're forest or agroecosystems, wetlands or grasslands, so these ecosystems can continue to provide the important services that humans value. And these services range from protecting biodiversity, to providing food, fiber, and fuel, to cleaning our air and water, to providing a spiritual respite or recreation or cultural identity. And as I'm going to talk about a lot later in my talk, capturing and storing carbon. And so if we want to help people make decisions, we actually need to know what decisions people need to make. And to do that, we use this very sophisticated approach, which is we go out and we ask people what decisions they need to make. And this is really why we say we do applied science, because the projects we work on and the questions that we will, at least we hope, be applied by the people who asked us the questions. And so far, I've been in this work for almost 4 years. I've found that people are really more than willing to tell us what decisions they need to make and what questions they need answered. And I think that even after about 4 years of asking a lot of people what they need, I have a lifetime of work to keep me going until retirement. And so here are just some of the partners that we have worked with in the past couple years for helping applying science to their decisions. These include agricultural groups like ocean spray cranberry growers who manage wetlands, forests, and grasslands across North America, or groups like General Mills that work with grain growers all across the American Midwest. It includes environmental nonprofits like the Environmental Defense Fund and national labs and federal agencies like the Department of Energy that are making decisions on how to fund and invest in scale climate solutions for climate mitigation. And there's two ways that we work. And the first I really want to emphasize is that we work with a whole team of really great researchers, both within our team, both within our group and also within Yale and beyond. Because remember, I told you that we source our projects from people who need to make decisions, and rarely are decisions about land management and ecology and ecosystems something that we just need ecological understanding. So while I'm an ecologist and I'd be really happy walking around a forest, identifying plants and talking about forest ecology, I don't have all the expertise that I need to help people make decisions about land stewardship and management. And so instead, we draw on a really deep and diverse interdisciplinary team of people who know things about business and money and finance and economics, people who know things about big data and statistical philosophy and conservation ethics or industrial ecology, who can combine these skills together to answer and address questions to help people make decisions. And the second way that we help people make decisions, besides having a great team of researchers, is by using data. And here's the catch about what we found of helping people make decisions, where we really use and synthesize real data, is that people want to make their decisions now. And so they want to act pretty quickly, and they might not be interested in waiting years for research to get funded, to design an experiment, to implement a study, to collect the data, and then analyze that data to give them an answer to their question. Because one thing that I have learned about after about 15 years of collecting empirical ecological research is that doing that process of collecting, analyzing, and publishing solid empirical field collected data, it's really slow. And so instead, we've decided here at YAS that we will focus on synthesizing existing data in an effort to speed up the process of providing answers. And so this is why we say we do applied science synthesis, which we hope means that we can bring the best available data forward to answer the most pressing questions about land management for ecosystem services. And so now that I've told you a little bit about who we are and how we work, I want to spend the rest of the talk sharing a bit of the synthesis that we've been working on. And to do that, I first have to tell you about what many of the questions about land management that practitioners and policymakers are asking right now. And this is about nature-based solutions. And the IUCN and the World Bank coined this term and idea in 2009. And you can see this like rapid uptick of the term right after they started using it. And it's taken off as a really compelling way to meet global environmental and sustainability challenges. And more specifically, people really want to know about nature-based solutions for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing that carbon in plants and soils. And of course, this conversation is really acute right now because of the latest IPCC's sixth assessment report that said we not only need to make immediate and deep cuts to carbon dioxide emissions to keep global temperatures below our target thresholds, but that now we also need to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And they write all pathways that limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius with limited or no overshoot project the use of carbon dioxide removal. So we find ourselves in this spot where not only do we need fossil fuel emissions reductions, but we also need to remove excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And the IPCC has actually told us that natural climate solutions, in particular improving how we manage our forests and croplands, are going to be a crucial component of mitigating climate change by removing that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And they write several mitigation options, notably improved forest and crop grassland management, are technologically viable, are becoming increasingly cost effective, and are generally supported by the public. So because of the recent high-level engagement in climate solutions from nations to corporations, some of the most pressing questions that policymakers and land managers are asking us actually have to do with managing ecosystems for carbon dioxide removal. And specifically, there's two types of questions that in decisions that people need to make or that broadly fall into these two bins. The first, Ben, is a question of, well, what exactly should we do? So, what does improved management mean for my forest? What management approaches will be the most likely to achieve our goals of carbon capture and storage by managing forests? How do we adapt our management to a changing climate? The second types of questions that we hear a lot is, how do we measure the impact? So if we decide we want to change how we manage our forest, how do I monitor the effects of those changes? If I want to invest in land management, how do I know that my investment is leading to the desired results? And this question is underpinning most of our forest carbon crediting and greenhouse gas emission accounting programs today. And we've been helping people address both types of questions here at YASP, and I'll tell you a little bit about each one. First, I'm going to use a case study where we were asked to lead a chapter in a national report commissioned by President Biden's Department of Energy to answer the question, how can the U.S. manage forests to remove more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? And then second, we have been collaborating with another research lab, the SPIRES lab, run by Dr. Luke Sanford here at Yale, which is the political science lab, to answer a question about how to measure carbon gains after implementing a management action in our forest. And so for the rest of the talk, I'm going to tell you how we are answering these two big questions. So for the first question, how can the U.S. manage forests to remove more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? We've published our full findings in response to the DOE's question about forest management in a collaborative report called Roads to Removal, which was published in December of 2024, and where we actually provided 3 potential options for forest carbon dioxide removal across the United States. And I want to acknowledge all the faculty and postdocs and students that co-authored and contributed to the findings that I'm sharing here today. And we couldn't have done it without this great team of people. And for us, it wasn't really surprising that the DOE asked us this question about how should we be managing forests, because this is a really contentious question. And so if anyone has spent any time in this space, you probably have heard lots of debates about what we should or should not be doing. And a lot of these debates are pinned on narratives about these topics. And these narratives really span a huge range of opinions. Some of them, like the narrative on the left, are pretty grim and hopeless. Forests are no longer our climate friends. And this narrative is arguing that because of all the climate-induced disturbances like wildfires and droughts, that forests are not a climate solution that we can depend on at all. They're no longer our climate friends. We also have narratives like this narrative pictured in the center that are pretty exemplary of a preservationist mindset, something that we've been talking about for hundreds of years here in our country. It costs nothing to leave our trees as they are. And this narrative argues that the best way to manage our forests for climate mitigation is just to leave them alone, to let them grow. And then we also have narratives out there that are pretty exemplary of a conservationist mindset, a narrative of let's fill our cities with taller wooden buildings, which is arguing that we can protect forests, we can mitigate climate change, and we can still extract natural resources to support people's livelihoods, all in one simultaneous action. And so the bigger question for the DOE or for anyone who's working in forests in the United States or around the world is, how do we provide a compelling answer to this question when we have such a complex landscape with so many different narratives? And I think we can draw some lessons from these narratives. The first is that we really have to include climate-related disturbances into any answer we're going to give to this question. Because ignoring the very real and very likely potential that our forest will lose carbon in the future to wildfires, to droughts, to storms, to pests, pathogens, and diseases will give an incomplete answer to this question. The second lesson that's really important is recognizing that people have different values and they prioritize different services that forests provide, like habitat for biodiversity or revenue for rural communities or essential products that we all use in our day-to-day lives. So to answer this question fully, it's also important in our analysis to acknowledge and report on how various management options will affect these different services. And so if we need to account for all these natural disturbances in our answer, then we can't give a one-size-fits-all answer to how do we manage forests for climate mitigation if different forests are facing very different sets of climate disturbances. And so these maps here represent estimated forest carbon emissions from 3 very different types of disturbances that we see across the coterminous United States forest. The darker the green a county means the greater the carbon loss to that disturbance and the greater the impact of that disturbance on the landscape. And so we know that out west, our western forests in the US, many of them are now actually net annual carbon sources, not sinks, meaning they emit more carbon dioxide on the whole to the atmosphere than they are pulling down in tree growth because of wildfires that are burning trees and vegetation and even soils. We know that in the southeastern United States, we lose a lot of carbon from hurricanes and windstorms that will topple and kill the trees. And then here in the northeastern United States, and in some places near any of you who are tuning in from Michigan in the upper Midwest, that we have a really diverse and abundant suite of introduced pests and pathogens that are killing dominant trees and are leading to carbon emissions through those tree deaths. And so to really address this question, we have to consider the regional context of forest management in each region. And so should you venture to read our report or the surrounding peer-reviewed publications that support them, you'll see that we provide three very different options across the country for the Department of Energy to consider. We could adopt fire resilient forest management treatments in the Western United States, trying to reduce the impact of those catastrophic wildfires on forest. We could think about planting vast acres of pine trees across the southeastern United States, or by promoting small family forest land, or we could look in the northeastern United States and the southern New England and think about promoting small family forest landowners to use sustainable silvicultural practices, which could provide income, promote tree regeneration, and allow forests to continue capturing carbon. And while I wish I had time to tell you about all three of these opportunities, I'm going to focus today just on forest management for the forests we have here in Connecticut and Massachusetts and southern New England. And so, okay, we've narrowed this now question down to how can we manage southern New England forests to remove more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? And this work, I just want to say, was led by a former postdoc working with me at YASP, Dr. Ware Liu, who's pictured here. And so remember these lessons. If lesson number one is that we need to include disturbances in our models, then there are a few that we need here in the northeastern United States. These are windstorms, droughts, and pests and pathogens. And while windstorms and extreme weather don't in aggregate cause as much forest carbon loss in the northeastern United States relative to what we see in the southeastern United States, we do have our fair share of notable hurricanes. We have the hurricane of 1938, which we can still see legacies of on the landscape, or even more recently, back in 2008, we had Hurricane Sandy come through and knock over a lot of trees, like pictured here on the town green. We also have a lot of these smaller microbursts or small tornadoes that happen. And this is just a picture of a 2018 tornado that popped up in a nearby state park just right up the road from New Haven that took out about 3,000 trees in the state park surrounding where the microburst happened. We also have this, again, very diverse range of forest pests that increase tree mortality, generally species-specific tree mortality. And these are just 4 different pest or pathogen or disease agents that are really common right now in southern New England's forest. And they're known to lead to rapid tree death of some of the most common and ubiquitous tree species that we have in our forest stands. We also have an emerging debate over what to do and how to manage our forest. The state of Massachusetts is still talking. They've come out of a tree cutting moratorium from a few years ago, but they're still talking about how they should manage state forest lands that really pit these two distinct views of whether the state of Massachusetts should ban all logging activities on state lands for climate reasons, or if there are sustainable ways for forest managers to harvest trees within the state lands. And so to answer this question, we actually use simulation modeling of how southern New England's forests might grow in the future in response to these 3 different management options that I'll go into in a second, and 3 different disturbance scenarios. And to do this modeling, we used fine-scale forest inventory data, which we found and are represented by all these gray hashes. These are small gray hashes and black dots scattered across this map of southern New England, thanks to the Massachusetts Department of Forestry, the New York City Water Authority, and the U.S. Forest Service forest inventory and analysis plots. And we use the U.S. Forest Service forest vegetation simulation model, which is a standard tool used by the Forest Service to project future forest conditions and is frequently used in these carbon analyses. The three management options that we considered was first the no harvest option, right? That falls in line with that preservationist viewpoint, an approach to forest management of no harvest, no touch, no management. We also explored something that we called an exploitation harvest, which was a harvest scenario that maximizes the present day value of a forest by removing all the high value trees above a certain size. And these types of harvests are really common across New England. And what they do is they maximize wood products from the present day, but they tend to result in a forest that's filled with denser, smaller trees and a more even size distribution in the long run. And so for any foresters who are listening in the audience, we actually simulated a diameter limit cut on 25-year rotations on a 12-inch DBH or greater. We finally considered a sustainable harvest scenario, or what we call a sustainable harvest scenario for the region, which is considered more sustainable because it promotes the regeneration of a wider diversity and higher abundance of tree seedlings by actually increasing the amount of trees harvested to open up the canopy to light, but also leaving mature seed trees within the forest to fill those canopy gaps. And so again, for the foresters in the audience, we simulated two different types of shelter wood treatments depending on the forest type, both on a 100-year rotation and both harvesting trees over a 2-inch diameter at breast height. For our three natural disturbance options, we simulated 100 years of forest growth under three different conditions. One, under no natural disturbances, right? Assuming no wind, no mortality, excess mortality from wind or pest and pathogens. An extreme weather scenario that had cyclical drought every 10 years and one major windstorm like that tornado or a hurricane. And then an extreme weather scenario coupled with those four pest and pathogens or disease agents that I described earlier that each increase the mortality of specific tree species of specific sizes within the forest. And here's what we found. And I'm going to walk you through this figure before I start giving you the data. On the bottom x-axis, we have the years after cutting, assuming that in year one of our simulation, the harvest activity occurred. And on the y-axis, we have the carbon storage in tons of carbon per hectare. So that's the amount of carbon on the forest land within a hectare of forest on average across all these plots. And to start, I'm going to show you carbon stored in various carbon pools within the forest. And so this is going to include living and dead tree parts that are above the ground, dead trees that have fallen to the forest floor, and then living and dead tree roots. And so here's what we find. We find that under this optimistic future scenario with no disturbances, that in fact, letting trees grow may leave us with the most dense carbon stocks through time, right here under this no harvest panel, no disturbance. And you can see that either doing the exploitation harvest simulations or the sustainable harvest simulations, that by the end of the years, we can see the loss of the tree stocks, which are a result of the harvest, that at the end of the year, we only have 71% of the total carbon in our exploitation harvest relative to our no harvest, or 92% of the carbon stocks in our sustainable harvest relative to our no harvest scenario. And if this were to be the scope of your evaluation, and importantly, a lot of evaluations tend to leave this as their scope with no disturbance, that carbon stocks, especially over a shorter time period, you now might say that the no harvest strategy seems to be the best for carbon stocks and climate mitigation because we have the most carbon stored across all time points under these scenarios. But we really have to ask ourselves, how realistic is this scenario? And I would argue, considering the fact that we are in now another major drought here in Connecticut this fall and have not had a lot of rain over the past 2 months, that this is a pretty rosy picture for the next 100 years. And that probably this scenario is really incomplete to what we might project to happen. So what happens when we start to simulate these extreme weather events in our forest? Well, you can see this spike of initial tree mortality from the extreme weather events laying to standing dead trees in this light green right here. And these will eventually fall to the forest floor and are represented in this purple fallen dead tree pool right there. You can also see these punctuated drought events that are leading to punctuated tree mortality through time. And it's overall reducing the forest's ability to regrow along the same slope that we see in the no harvest, no disturbance scenario. And so in general, we see what we would expect, which is that under these extreme but very likely weather conditions, a forest stand could be a poor long-term reservoir for carbon. And if you are someone with a grim sense of the future, then you might say, see, I told you so. Forests are no longer our climate friends because climate change is going to make them unreliable carbon storage facilities, because you can see all the carbon that we've lost just by simulating these extreme weather events in these forests today. But when we start to look at the interactions between these harvesting activities and extreme weather, I think we see a more hopeful picture. So these red dashed lines now represent the carbon stocks in our unharvested forest under extreme weather. And we see that under both harvest scenarios, that our forest trees are recovering biomass, especially in our sustainable harvest scenario, 45 years after that extreme weather event. And that was that hurricane or tornado that we simulated. And this recovery of forest biomass is really a function of the diverse and abundant tree seedlings that we expect to recruit into the forest after it's sustainably harvested, that then grow to fill that open canopy area. In the no harvest scenario, we still have smaller understory trees and saplings that are recruiting up to the canopy, but because it's a closed canopy forest, they're at a slower rate than the younger forest in the sustainable harvest scenario. And then finally, when we layer on the extreme weather scenario with the pests and pathogens, we see this further reduction. These red lines are now showing what happens with only extreme weather. We see this further reduction of living tree biomass, and that's a function of our ash, beech, and oak trees, which were the targets of these specialist insects and disease pests and pathogens. They died at higher rates from these introduced organisms. And so this narrative that forests are no longer our climate friends is partially true. If we think that our future is going to involve extreme disturbances and continued introductions of pests and pathogens that are challenging our forest health, which does seem pretty darn likely, then our forests are also likely going to store less carbon on the landscape than our models predict in the absence of disturbances. But what I also hope you can see is that there's evidence that we might be able to manage our forest in ways that can increase their resilience to these future disturbances and also increase their standing carbon stocks. And so while this narrative that our forests are going to suffer with climate change is not wrong, I think it is wrong to suggest that we can't be friends to our forests by implementing more sustainable management options. So I've shown you there's strong interaction between projections of impacts of forest management and future disturbances, but this is only the forest carbon that's found within our forest lands. And of course, we're missing a really key carbon pool, which is all that harvested wood that came out of the forest, which is also storing carbon as long as that wood product is in use. And so here are our same figure of forest carbon pools that include this in the forest carbon, along with harvested wood products, now shown in orange and blue. And we can see that if we expand our carbon accounting boundaries to include sort of this out of forest carbon, that after 100 years, under this no disturbance, our sustainable harvest scenario now has reaccumulated 99% of the carbon that was lost, or 89% in the exploitation harvest. Okay, so now I've given you a lot of different ways that the future of a forest in southern New England could look, because these are all projection models based on a series of assumptions that I hope I clearly laid out for you. And so we want to go back to this question that the DOE asked, which is how can the US manage forests to remove more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? We can see that the answer is really highly contingent on your assumptions about what will happen in the future, and also your time frame that you want to consider. And so this heat map is just showing you the same data in a different way, but it's showing you that on shorter year timelines, like in 25 years, any harvest scenario is going to lose carbon in the short term, as indicated by these darker red cells. But as you move towards longer time frames, so 100 years into the simulation, and you also assume that we're going to start seeing more extreme disturbances, the arguments for harvesting as a means to foster resilient forests do have supporting evidence. But I will leave you with these 9 panels, which all just represent, again, projections of how the future might be, which also show you how we can actually reconcile a lot of these diverging narratives about the future of forest carbon stocks by distilling out underlying assumptions that people have about the future. So now I've just told you that in deciding what we do with our managed lands requires us to make some guesses about what we think the future is going to look like. And so it follows that it would make sense if we're making decisions with imperfect information and making all these assumptions, then a really responsible and reasonable question for us to ask is, after I make a management decision and implement it on the landscape, how can I tell if what I'm doing is actually working? How do I measure the impact of that action on the landscape? And so for the rest of the talk, I'm going to tell you about another project that we've been working on at YAS that falls into this bin of how do we measure impact. And to talk about this, I actually want to talk about something. I want to go sort of outside of forest carbon for a second and introduce the concept of causal inference. And I'm going to begin by contextualizing it with these pictures of what we call old fields. And hopefully many of you on the webinar today have been in or seen before. And these are open agricultural fields or pastures, and they're really common throughout the eastern United States. And these open fields are a legacy effect of extensive waves of deforestation and forest harvest that occurred from the early 17th to the early 20th centuries, which are represented in these maps across the top. Oops. Represented in these maps across the top of black and loss of forest land through time. Much of the eastern United States today has actually reverted back to forest from this extensive deforestation, but there still are landowners that maintain a lot of acres in open areas for a lot of different reasons. So often these old fields are aesthetically pleasing, especially in the late fall, like the scene on the left, which is taken from my graduate studies in Tennessee, all the blooming goldenrod and asters. Some people keep their fields open for more practical purposes, such as using them for bedding for hay or on farms, like this one on the right in New York State on Shelter Island. Others will maintain them for habitats for wildlife species or for game animals that thrive in these early successional open field ecosystems adjacent to forest. But what's important to know about these old fields is that if we don't mow or burn them frequently every couple years, they begin to regrow back to forest. And that's what we call natural regeneration. And this is exactly what's happening in the picture on the upper left, which was taken at our Yale Myers research camp here in Connecticut, where an old field hasn't been mowed or burned for over 5 years. And we can see these really happy birch trees moving right on into that field. You can see that same field in this aerial image on the right. We can see that the tree cover is gradually filling in what once was a big open field area. And this reversion of forest is really likely to occur in any deforested area that's left undisturbed without human intervention in most regions around the world, not just here in the eastern United States. Okay, so let's say we want to convert these old fields back to forests because we think that's a good thing to do, reforestation for climate mitigation. And let's say we want to do that by paying people to grow trees in these fields. This could be for reforestation for climate mitigation. It could also be for enhancing biodiversity. It might be for even for things like growing biomass for biochar, bioenergy, or sustainable aviation fuel. But let's consider that we want to understand the net impact, the net greenhouse gas impact, or the net carbon impact of paying people to grow more trees. To do that, we would need to track a lot of different carbon stocks and carbon emissions and all the various sources of greenhouse gas emissions, which I have represented here in green, as well as changes in carbon stock, which I have in blue. And just to link to what I just showed you before, I was tracking carbon stocks in the last project, and now I'm talking about a larger analysis that's looking at all these different emissions and stocks. And by tracking all these changes in stocks and emissions, we might feel confident that we're accounting for all the carbon stocks and fluxes associated with our tree planting project. And this is exactly what some of my colleagues actually did for that DOE report that I told you for the southeastern United States. Bingchuan Zhang and Yuan Yao projected out the net greenhouse gas impacts of a massive reforestation campaign of marginal pasture, old field agricultural land in the southeastern United States with loblolly pine. And what they found was that depending on how densely you planted the trees, how you managed the plantations with or without thinnings, and whether the trees were eventually harvested, like in a commercial plantation, or left as a pine restoration project, that these plantations could absorb between 1.5 to 1.8 billion tons of carbon dioxide over 20 years, and up to 3.3 to 4 billion tons of carbon dioxide over 100 years. And the tool they use to come up with these numbers are called life cycle assessments. And it's a really excellent effort to project out how a reforestation initiative over a really large landscape scale could contribute to national net zero goals. And that's one of the reasons that we incorporated it into our Roads to Removal report. But what they were working on was attributional accounting, which is useful for projecting, again, projecting out the potential benefits of a climate mitigation action. And it's not the same as tracking the actual impact of a reforestation intervention in real time. So in other words, while these models might give us confidence that we could capture a lot of carbon or reduce a lot of emissions and pursue these projects, we would need to change our accounting approaches to track the real-time impacts of tree planting efforts if we were to implement this strategy on the ground. And so let's say we wanted to undertake a reforestation campaign in the southeastern United States. Given who owns the land, mostly a lot of small private landowners, we'd likely need to convince a lot of small private family forest owners to plant trees on these sites. And one way we could do this would be to pay them, potentially through carbon credit sales, to grow trees on their property. And we could then track in real time, as represented by this cartoon schematic, of the net carbon benefits of tree growth from the date of the initial payment and planting. But to track how effective our payments are at creating a larger carbon stock in the landscape, we don't need to just track carbon gains in the fields that we planted trees through time. We also need to know what would have happened to those fields in the absence of paying that landowner. In other words, how much carbon stocks changed in that same field with no carbon payment. And as I mentioned earlier, there are many possible futures or counterfactuals for any given field that we decide to plant a tree in. So for example, some landowners might have continued mowing that field year on year, maintaining a stable carbon balance year after year. If this was the true counterfactual or trajectory of this site, then the carbon benefits from the tree planting payment would be the net carbon benefit represented by this aqua blue shading here between this green line and this darker blue line here. But the landowner might have decided at some point in the future to stop mowing the fields at some point in the future. Maybe their mower breaks, maybe the kids inherit the property and decide they no longer want to maintain the task of mowing the field anymore. If this is the true counterfactual, meaning these fields were going to naturally revert back to forest because someone stopped mowing or burning them, then the net carbon gain is represented now by this line here in this additional area right here. If you're used to carbon credit lingo, the carbon benefits in this lower blue area would be considered non-additional because they would have occurred even without that carbon credit payment. And if you issue carbon credits for both these blue areas, and the true future of the field was going to be this natural revegetation, then you now have overcredited your carbon benefits by counting non-additional carbon. And so these decisions about what might have happened in the future are crucial because you can see what baseline you choose for comparing carbon benefits directly affects your estimate of those benefits. And this is the fundamental problem of causal inference. And I want to highlight two key points. First, there's a lot of what we would call information asymmetry here between the owner of a land and anyone else. This means that a landowner knows a lot more about their property and what they are likely to do or not do with it in the future. And I'm going to come back a little bit later about why this is important. Second, even though the landowner knows more than what we do about their property, we can still never know, and that landowner can never know actually what's going to happen in the future, right? We're still guessing at what's going to happen in the future when we're trying to estimate these baselines. And so as a result, the system boundaries of a reforestation project has to expand to include the estimation of this counterfactual or baseline scenario, then transitions it from this attributional accounting framework to a consequential or impact accounting framework. But I just really want to emphasize that measuring this counterfactual is really challenging. And determining the correct counterfactual or baseline to ensure carbon credit additionality is a real significant challenge for any nature-based carbon crediting accounting scheme. And this is central if you've heard anything about debates about the carbon market or forest carbon credits or academics who are saying that there's a lot of over-crediting happening. This almost certainly has to do with how we are doing baselines and counterfactuals in these accounting schemes. And so one reason that this is really hard to get a grip on is that there's over 30 different forest carbon crediting protocols in use that cover a wide variety of different activities we can do in our forest. And so this is in collaboration again with a political scientist and a statistician, where we wanted to ask, how are these different protocols assessing baselines? So these different carbon crediting protocols, how are they assessing baselines? Are the baseline methods varying by year or activity type? And what assumptions underlie each of the baseline methods? And so to explore these questions, my colleagues and I examined the baseline approaches of 34 different forest carbon crediting protocols, and we developed a statistical framework to evaluate the key assumptions required to justify the use of any forest carbon crediting project or protocol. And we found that protocols generally rely on three broad categories of baselines, or how they're determining what the future might be. And each are grounded in key assumptions that we think should be carefully considered when determining the best baseline approach for a given scenario. The first category we found are model-based baselines, which are established at the start of a carbon project, and it's what we call ex-ante baselines. These models can range from something like a simple historic average, what was the historic carbon stock in the past of the site conditions, to form a representative control. The core assumption behind this approach is that the past reliably predicts the future, meaning that environmental conditions and management practices are going to remain stable over time. And this assumption is illustrated by that flat blue line in the graph on the right. However, these model-based baselines can also be more complex. We can incorporate statistical models or growth and yield models or biogeochemical models that can estimate the relationship between environmental conditions, tree growth, and management decisions to represent a future projection of what might happen in the forest. And regardless of their complexity or their structure, all these model-based approaches share a common assumption, which is the existence of this perfect model, or a model that is unbiased and is capable of accurately predicting both human behavior and ecological processes on future tree growth. The final category of baselines we identified is what we call design-based or matching baselines. Rather than predicting the future before a project could begin, these approaches will match a project site with similar areas that could have enrolled in a carbon crediting program but did not. So in other words, you find a field, you pay a landowner to plant trees, and then you find some other fields where you don't pay the landowner and you track what happens on their property. But by tracking the carbon stock changes in these matched reference areas in real time, these design-based methods establish a baseline, which we call ex post, which is a baseline measurement alongside project measurements. And this is a commonly used approach in causal inference fields like political science or epidemiology. Design-based methods are relying on this one key assumption, which is that we have enough data and we have enough covariables that we can identify truly comparable non-enrolled sites or fields to match with to serve as valid matches or controls. And if that assumption holds, then these match controls can then be used to measure in real time how carbon stocks would have changed at the project site in the absence of paying someone to plant trees. And there's a lot of different variants of these methods that have been used in academic studies that are documenting the widespread overcrediting of these forest carbon projects. And so across these 34 protocols, what baseline methods are actually being used? When we look at baseline types across the three main categories of forest carbon crediting activity, which is avoiding conversion of forests, so not changing a forest into another land use, or afforestation, reforestation, planting trees, or improved forest management, some sort of sustainable or change to our approach of how we manage our forest, we actually find no clear difference in baseline type by activity. However, you do see a really strong preference for people using historical average or modeling approaches over these matching methods for any of these different forest activities. It's also worth noting that many protocols issue credits for multiple activity types, and they often allow for one or more baseline methods. And so as a result, the total count shown in this chart exceeds the 34 protocols that we included in our review. However, we do find a clear trend when we look at the time at which the protocol was written. So if we looked at protocols published before 2022 or updated after 2022, and that's the time point when all those critiques of baseline inflation began gaining traction, we see that there is a marked increase in adopting these matching-based protocols. So 2022 protocols are much more likely to use matching over historical average and modeling than those earlier protocols. And I would hypothesize that this shift is in direct response to the growing volume and intensity of criticism on forest carbon programs. And so now the obvious question here is well, which one of these baseline methods is best? And I'm sorry, but I'm not going to actually tell you that because in part, this is really not a science question, but it's more of a policy question about evaluating assumptions and also evaluating how easy it is to apply these different methods to these different projects. But what we do try to do is provide in the paper a framework for thinking about when the assumptions behind each of these baseline types might be reasonable. So, for example, are there places where past human activity and vegetation cover are relatively stable, making these historical averages a reasonable assumption? I think it's possible that you could argue that if you think of nations that have a lot of forest and low deforestation rates, HFLD nations, that you might expect that history would be a good predictor of the future. So perhaps historical average would be good for these nations under these conditions. You might also ask, are there situations where we can reasonably model human behavior and tree growth with high accuracy, where we do have a perfect and unbiased model that can represent environmental, economic, and human behavioral decisions? And I think it might be reasonable to say that commercial monoculture plantations, where landowners keep detailed management records and where extensive research has gone into developing these robust growth and yield models based on empirical data, might be a really good place to turn for these model baseline approaches. Finally, I'd argue that in many places around the world, where global market demand or geopolitics or climate change are driving a lot of unpredictability in land use and forest dynamics, that these model-based assumptions become too uncertain for project-level crediting. And in such cases, developers may need to rely on matching baseline techniques to generate more conservative and credible carbon estimates. And just a final note, going back to that idea of information asymmetry between landowners and program designers, all protocols will face something called selection bias, which happens when landowners most likely to benefit from a baseline method are also more likely to enroll in a program. Meaning, if you tell people you'll pay them to plant trees, the people who are already more inclined to plant trees will be more likely to take that money and plant trees. And so this leads to non-additional credits and over-crediting if this happens in your program. And so model-based or ex-ante approaches are especially vulnerable to this kind of adverse selection since landowners know more about their future plans than protocol developers. And it really isn't about bad faith. This is a structural issue in how we design these programs. When we rely on historical data to predict future behavior, it creates space for information asymmetry to influence enrollment. These ex post matching baselines reduce that risk by using observed outcomes in control areas, but they're also not immune to selection bias because if you have missing covariates or you have poor matches, it can still introduce bias into these procedures. And so to scale any of these approaches responsibly, improving and standardizing the matching criteria is really essential. And so with that, I am done. Sorry, I only have 11 minutes left, but thank you for listening to me share a bit of what we've been up to at EASP. And I hope this gives you a flavor of how we help people make decisions and the types of research that we have done. And Evan, happy to entertain some questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you for that presentation, Sarah. That was awesome. So we had a question from the audience specifically about slide 59, I believe it was.
Okay.
If you want to pull that up for the audience here. Um, so their question was, did the tree planting carbon assessment consider more frequent disturbances as the first project did? So I think they're referring to the increases in carbon there. What did that look like?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, no. So one thing I learned in this exercise for the Department of Energy, where we sort of had our different case studies, we had different access to different data sets in different modeling tools, and and there's different complexities. And so what Ewan and Bing Chuan were able to account for, like all the emissions coming out of these intense harvesting activities and a lot of the other things, I'll actually go to this slide, right? What I presented was a more simple forest growth model that basically just took into account changes in these stocks. But we didn't take into account any of these carbon emissions coming from any of these green bins. So Yuan and Bing Chuan were able to do a more complex modeling procedure that did account for all of those. But I think one of the trade-offs where they weren't able to do the sort of spatially explicit mortality that we were able to do using the forest vegetation simulation model that we used in the Northeastern example. The one thing that they did do, and if you look at these red arrow bars here, they sort of did say, let's assume overall that we are overly optimistic or overly pessimistic in what we think is going to happen. So they didn't simulate a hurricane, but they did simulate an overly optimistic or overly pessimistic scenario. And that's the bounds of these error bars. So I can't remember the details, but would be happy to share these reports or look into the reports and share with whoever asked this question about sort of what their deductions were. But you might be able to say, well, under some really bad windstorm events or a pine beetle outbreak or something in the southeastern United States, this would be at the bottom end of these red bars right here. These are our pessimistic scenario options, but it wasn't explicitly modeled. It's a good question.
Gotcha. Great. Thank you for that. We have a question in the chat here that I'm sorry, I'm actually going to take. So it's about any other conferences or events that focus on carbon aspects like additionality, permanence. So we, the Forest Carbon and Climate Program, actually host a number of webinar series and have hosted some webinar series that highlight these things. I'll send a link in the chat to our whole webinar page that there's recordings on there that talk about future research needs in the fields of additionality and baselines and the whole fun carbon markets. There's also some like basic drivers. But I guess sort of on that question pointed for you, Sarah, what does YASP's public outreach look like? Do you guys have other webinar series or what do you guys do to engage with the public?
Yeah, thanks. So we actually also have a webinar series, so we can webinar everyone out. We are hosting a Yale Forest Forum webinar series, and if I'm deft enough, I will try to find that link to share. The Yale Forest Forum runs every semester on a variety of topics, but this semester we are running one called Frontiers in Forest Carbon Accounting, where oh, thanks, Evan, you put it up there for me, where we are exploring a lot of these topics. Some of them are getting to really technical nitty-gritty if people like that, of additionality, leakage, permanence, and sort of where the conversations are happening and where the implementation challenges are within carbon markets. We also have run some past series that you can find on the Yale Forest Forum website that are also more general, but are a couple years old as well. So things change quickly in carbon markets. So perhaps the Evans series will be more timely as well.
Yeah, no, I don't say this ironically. We could always use more webinars. This is such an evolving space. And there's so many smart people out there, and we like having people like you talk about the work you do because it's awesome. I think we have time for maybe one or two more. Um, this one might not have a sound answer, but how did you handle leakage in the pasture to tree study?
Yeah. Um, Leakage is not an area where we spend a lot of time, but a really important question. The idea of leakage is if you stop harvesting or you reduce market supply of a commodity, in a tree example, it would be a wood product. Does someone else cut down their forest to meet that existing demand? The pasture to tree study was really focused in on additionality and baselines of just thinking through how we would deal with baselines. So we actually didn't do any carbon accounting in that study. I will say, though, these matching methods that people are talking about in carbon accounting terms, where you find similar sites and you track what happens in real time alongside the carbon project, depending how you design that sampling design, you might be able to make estimates about leakage. And like the example is if you reduce harvest on a property for a carbon project and you reduce that wood supply, but you're measuring a bunch of other forest stands that are in the same geographic region or the same mill shed as that forest carbon project, if you see an uptick in harvest on those lands, you might then infer that you are indeed seeing leakage and that market forces are driving other actors to harvest more wood to like meet that demand. So the matching approaches we talked about have been proposed for dealing with additionality and baseline issues, but they also can address some of these other issues in carbon market as well. But we didn't put numbers to those.
Yeah, leakage can be so difficult to quantify. Not to plug our webinar series again, but we talk about how it's an issue in every aspect of carbon markets and carbon quantification. It's extremely pervasive. Um, so definitely a good question, something that we have to consider when thinking about carbon projects, because um, yeah. Um, cool. It looks like we have a few more here. It's 3:56. Yeah, let's see if we can speed around another question because this is fun. Um, so this says in these reforestation models, are you also including forest plant layers like understory shrub and ground cover plants? Then related, would paying landowners to plant trees also promote forest ecosystems, or is it more like a single species monoculture?
Yeah. Um, So, in answer to the first question about modeling sort of the other carbon stocks, the other vegetation understory, the forest vegetation simulator is not modeling those carbon stocks. Generally, in at least eastern temperate forests, this is not true for tropical forests, but in eastern temperate forests where we are, the vegetation, the non-tree canopy tree vegetation represents less than 10% of all of the carbon within the forest. That is not to say it's not important. It's something like 90% of the plant biodiversity in eastern forest. A former student who worked with me actually calculated these numbers. 90% of the biodiversity in eastern deciduous forest are found in the understory. The understory is quite important in forest, but if your unit of measure is carbon and you want to track large carbon gains, you are mostly going to see those from the addition and removal of trees. The other important that isn't in this question that I will just say to highlight, also a huge portion of carbon, upwards of 50% of carbon within a forest, is actually held within the soil. And so soil carbon stocks are generally not modeled in a lot of these. The plantation study that I showed you, one of the really cool things that UN and Bing Chuan did was they actually modeled soil carbon stock losses and gains in response to commercial plantation activities. So they did try to capture some of those carbon losses or emissions. Um, but we have to, again, like all these models have limitations, so it's good to ask about them, and we did not model that. Now I've forgotten the second part of the question.
Let's see, I'll pull it up really quick. It's relating to planting monocultures.
Oh,
When we do these projects, are we promoting a whole ecosystem, or what does that generally look like?
yeah. So the project that I showed you that we modeled out or that Yuan and Bing Chuan modeled out was for plantation forest. And the reason they chose that is if we were going to try to do massive reforestation over hundreds of thousands of acres, the easiest way to do that would be planting monoculture in the southeast pine plantations, like logistically providing that many seedlings and getting trees in the ground and knowing how to grow them. Um, Ideally, a reforestation campaign, even at that scale, would do some combination of both trying to reestablish more diverse natural forest. If we're talking about the southeastern United States, it would be great to do some pine plantations if we're doing climate mitigation to get trees on the ground, capturing carbon, growing fast, but also then thinking about those more diverse ecosystems that we have down there and working to also restore those. But it would really just depend on the program and the policymakers and how they design the program and what they paid people to do. It would be cheaper to pay people to plant one single species than to plant or to promote like a diverse natural regeneration. But again, that's all. These are not science questions. These are all policy questions of how do we want to achieve this thing and what are we trying to do? Just carbon and biodiversity. What is the goal?
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. Well, we're at 4 o'clock on the nose here. So really quick, I'm going to share my screen so you all can see our upcoming webinars. Again, you can scan these QR codes to join our listserv and to sign up for the next webinar. I'd like to say a massive thank you to Sara Kuebbing for presenting today. We had so much positive feedback. I was engaged the whole time. That was so fascinating. Thank you for sharing everything about YASP. And we hope to see you all in the future on November 5th. So Thanks, Sarah, and thanks everybody for attending. Have a great rest of your day.
All right. Thanks so much, Evan and Anna.
Bye.